Hey, welcome back to MetFlex and Chill. This is Gregory, your host, and it's Friday, which means it is Q&A day, and we have a solo Q&A today with a bunch of questions to answer. So before we get started, just a quick note. In today's episode, I'm going to be referencing a lot of previous episodes just because there was a lot of questions related to previous topics that I've gone into with guests that we've had on before and some other solo episodes as well. So I'm going to dive into, obviously, answering the questions today, but I will refer you back to some previous episodes. So if you go to the show notes, you'll see that everything that I talk about is linked in the show notes. So if you're listening to this on iTunes, you can swipe up and you'll see the show notes there. If you're listening to this on Spotify or another platform, usually there's a place where it says more info and you can click that and it'll show you the show notes. And then also, if none of that works, you can actually just go to my website, metflexlife.com, and in the top menu bar, you'll see podcast, or actually you'll see resources. If you click that, it'll have a drop-down menu to podcast. You can click on that, and that's where all the show notes are, and that will have all of the links to any of the previous episodes that I mentioned in today's episode and for all episodes. So definitely check that out. If I reference something and you can't find the episode for some reason, you can always go there and just click the link and it'll bring you directly to that episode. All right, without further ado, let's get into the questions for today. All right, first question. How do I strategically choose when to have cheat meals to optimize recovery and performance? Okay, so I've talked about this before, and I feel like a lot of people say this too, but I hate referring to cheat meals as cheat meals, right? I hate using the word cheat. It just sounds like so negative and like has a lot of guilt behind it. So especially for this question, you asked when to have cheat meals to optimize recovery and performance. I feel like you mean more so like when to have refeed meals to optimize recovery and performance, or maybe carb ups. So to answer that, it really just all depends. I mean, a lot of questions all depend, but for this specifically, it depends on, where you're at with your nutrition. So what is your overall caloric intake at right now? Because with refeeds, we know that they can be really beneficial if you're in a fat loss phase, but when you're at maintenance or in a slight surplus or in a surplus, refeed meals usually don't, for me personally, I don't usually incorporate refeed meals if I'm at maintenance or in a surplus just because I don't need them. And usually with clients, we don't really implement refeed meals unless there's for example, a specific event that you have on a weekend and you want to push more calories to that event so you have less calories during the week. That's more getting into calorie cycling, but in terms of refeeds, usually those are usually you have refeeds when you're in a fat loss phase, right? So when you're incorporating refeeds in a fat loss phase to optimize recovery and performance, again, it all depends on what works for you, really. I would say that usually when I'm incorporating refeeds in a fat loss phase or with clients, it's either 1 day a week or even 2 days a week back to back. Sometimes it's, every other week, and it really just depends, right? So I would say I don't know. It's so individualized, this question, just because everybody's so different. But in general, maybe just, I would say try it out. Try out like 1 refeed a week and see how you feel. And then it also comes back to what type of nutrition protocol you're following. So when I say that, I mean are you following a lower carb keto diet? Are you following, or low carb keto diet in the sense of a strict keto diet? So with no carb ups or anything like that? Are you following more of a cyclical ketogenic diet where you're incorporating carb ups? Are you following a high carb diet? It depends, right? So if you're following a strict low carb keto diet where you're not incorporating carb ups, maybe you have a refeed that just increases your calories. Maybe you're just, for 1 day of the week, you're increasing calories to your maintenance level, and that's your refeed. Maybe that comes in the form of fats, right? Or if you're someone who's incorporating a cyclical ketogenic diet or a cyclical low carb diet, maybe you're increasing, calories via carbohydrates once a week or twice a week. And that would be in the form, obviously, of carbohydrates. And this could help with replenishing muscle glycogen stores. Muscle glycogen, and glycogen is just the storage form of glucose. And we know that carb up meals can help to do that. We talk a lot about that on this podcast, because obviously we're talking about metabolic flexibility and incorporating carbs strategically. If you're following a higher carb diet, maybe you're just, again, increasing carbs or fats or calories as your refeed day. So it all depends in that sense. But also it depends to, what makes you feel best. Because you said, when do I strategically implement them to optimize recovery and performance? So some people, and this is something I've done too in the past, is like on my hardest training day of the week, I will put my refeed day on that day. So for example, if I have like a really, really hard, high volume leg day, I'll incorporate a refeed after that, which means that I'll have a post-workout meal that has, either a bolus of carbs or an increase in carbs, or if I'm, at a stage where I'm following a super strict keto or low carb diet, then maybe it's just an increase in calories overall. But at this day and age, not at this day and age, what am I talking about? At this stage in my life, most of my refeeds are in the form of carb ups. And when it comes post-workout, we know that our muscles are super sensitive to, or they're most insulin sensitive post-workout. So basically that just means that our muscles, after we work out, they're ready to just soak up any of the fuel that we give them. And especially in the sense of carbs, and when you're, consuming carbs post-workout and just calories in general, a lot of those calories are partitioned to refilling muscle glycogen stores, fueling your muscles for your next workout, all of that. Obviously, this is to a degree, right? So if you are consuming, tons and tons of calories over your, allotted caloric intake, then yes, some of that's going to spill over to fat stores. But basically I'm saying, after a workout, that is when your muscles are most insulin sensitive, and most sensitive in general to soak up all the nutrients. So that would be a good time to incorporate maybe a refeed meal, for example. But again, it all comes down to you as an individual, what works for you. Some people love to put their refeeds on weekends because, and this is something I do too, like for example, during a fat loss phase, maybe I'll put a really hard, maybe I'll structure my training so that I have a really hard leg day on a Saturday. And then after that, I can go out and enjoy, a nice meal out, have a little bit more calories, and that'll be my refeed. So hopefully that helped to answer your question. But again, it really just comes down to what works for you. Test out different things, test out what makes you feel best, what helps you to recover best and perform best. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question. All right, next question. Does fasting increase the amount of muscle breakdown? Okay, it depends. So this one would really depend on a few different factors. So the first one would be, how long are you fasting for, right? So that's the biggest thing. So in terms of fasting, there's so many different fasting protocols. Are you intermittent fasting? How long are you intermittent fasting for? Like, what's your eating window? What's your fasting window? Are you doing longer term fasting? So that would be one piece of it. Also, how frequently are you fasting? So if you're doing intermittent fasting, are you doing that every single day? Are you doing it every other day? Are you, doing it intermittently throughout the year? Do you go through periods of fasting, for a few weeks on, or maybe a few months on, and then a few months and a few weeks off? So that would be the frequency of it. Then this is also a big one. So your body size. So like how much body fat you have to actually like feed you when you're fasting will depend, right? So if you have the leaner you are and the longer you fast, the more likely you're going to be pulling energy from areas that you probably don't want to be. So the leaner you are, it means the less body fat you have, which means the less fuel in reserve that you have, right? So if you don't have enough fuel in reserve in the sense of body fat, then you're going to be pulling from muscle if you're fasting for, extended periods of time. It just makes sense logically, right? So the more body fat you have, the more energy reserves you have during that fasting period to pull that energy from to use to feed your body when you're in that kind of starvation state, which is what fasting is. So that would definitely be one of the biggest things. So again, the leaner you are and the longer you're fasting, the more that you're probably going to be breaking down a little bit of muscle for energy that you would want to, versus if you were a little bit, if you were on the heavier side, you had more body fat, you could definitely get away with more fasting without necessarily pulling from muscle as much as you would if you were leaner. So again, if you just think about that logically, it makes sense, right? And then also just realizing too that muscle takes energy itself to maintain and to obviously to also build. So that in itself is going to take energy. And so if you are fasting for long periods of time, you will have some muscle breakdown, just because we know that fasting is catabolic. That is, catabolic means breaking down, anabolic means building up. Fasting is catabolic to your body. So you're breaking things down in order to fuel yourself during that fast. So another thing too is if you're not combating your fasting with some type of anabolic stimulus for your muscles. So for example, like if you're not eating enough calories during your eating window, or if you're not eating enough protein during your eating window, that's one thing. If you're not resistance training overall, then that's something as well. So all of those things, right? Eating enough calories during your eating enough calories during your eating window, eating enough protein during your eating window. Oh my gosh. Resistance training. Those are all things that are going to mitigate some of that muscle breakdown. So those are a few of the things that you need to think about. It's really not like a yes or no answer in the sense of, does fasting increase the amount of muscle breakdown? In general, yes, it will. If you are fasting for long periods of time, if you are on the leaner side, if you're fasting very frequently, then you're probably going to get some muscle breakdown. But again, it depends. Depends on all the factors that I just talked about. So I would say, like, if your main goal is to build muscle, probably not super advantageous to be fasting for long periods of time. But again, depends where you're coming from, depends how much body fat you have, depends how much fuel reserves you have. Also depends, how much you're working out, right? We know that we need to resistance train in order to preserve and to build our muscles up, right? That makes sense. So yeah, that would be my answer to that question. Okay, next question. Does higher protein, for example, 1 gram per pound of body weight daily, impact longevity? Okay, so in my opinion, that's actually not even high protein. I would say that that's probably like a good amount of protein to have. Higher protein, in my opinion, would be probably anything upwards of 1.2 grams per pound of body weight. But also this depends on your body weight. So for example, I talk about this a lot, but if you are, overweight or obese, that might be way too much protein for you. So we might go off of lean body mass in that sense, or maybe you're going more towards 0.8 grams per pound of body weight. But if you are on the leaner side, and I guess closer to maybe your ideal body weight, then that, and when I say ideal, I just mean the body weight that you are, feel healthy at, it's in a good range. That would be more so 1 gram per pound of body weight is a really good place to be with that. So anyway, that's not answering your question, but that's just kind of my opinion on protein. But I also love protein, and I'm a huge advocate of a little bit higher protein diets anyway. So maybe I'm biased to that. But anyway, I would say, to answer your question, does higher protein impact longevity? In my opinion, yes, absolutely. And this would be definitely in a positive way. And the reason is because we know that protein in general is super important, especially as we age. The reason is because as we get older, both our bone health and our muscle tissue growth decline. That's just a part of aging. That's part of the life cycle, right? So keeping protein higher can actually prevent some of the catabolic processes that are happening with this, right? And it can actually slow things down. It can slow down the breakdown of this muscle tissue and can slow down the adverse effects that happen as we age with our bone health and just our overall health. We also know that muscle protein synthesis, that is just the process of using protein to build muscle, that also slows down as we age. So if we're keeping protein higher, it can help us to maintain more muscle tissue and also prevent more muscle breakdown. So that makes sense, right? So that would be, I mean, that's kind of like a short way of answering this question in the terms of, yes, I think that it's high protein is super important for longevity in a positive way. And in that sense, I actually dove into this topic specifically with Shawn in the episode that we talked about all things protein. That's what it's called. So it's episode 43, all things protein with Shawn. I will link that in the show notes so you can check it out. He dives into all things aging and protein and longevity. And we talk about sarcopenia and the issues that surround that. So I would definitely check out that episode. Again, it's episode 43, all things protein with Shawn, and I will link that in the show notes for you to check out. Next question, when to take a deload week? Okay, so I actually got this pretty much, I think it was the exact same question a few weeks ago. And so I recorded a podcast where I dove into all things in regards of what you should know for deload weeks, or when to take a deload week, what a deload week is. So I'm going to link that in the show notes. It's episode 58. The episode title is Using Heart Rate Zones During Training, Deload Weeks, Protein Shakes, and Best Nutrition Science Books. Again, I'll link that in the show notes so you can check out. I'm not going to dive into everything again, but the biggest thing with deload weeks, I think, is to, and in my opinion and in my history of taking deload weeks and training and working with clients, I personally think that you should be planning your deload weeks in advance and that they should be part of your training program, not something that you just incorporate kind of when you're starting to feel sore. And the reason for this is because the first thing is that there is a huge, in my opinion, there's a huge mental factor knowing that you have a deload week coming up. So for example, if you have a training block or a mesocycle is what we call it, say it's like a 4-week training block, and then on your 5th week, you know that you have a deload week. Going into that 4th week of training, it's probably going to be like, you're probably going to be, sore because you've gone through 4 weeks of hard training or 3 weeks of hard training. You're going to be sore. You're going to be, maybe a little bit less motivated, especially if you're following a program where you're within that cycle, you're doing the same exercises. So knowing that you have a deload week coming up the 5th week, right, you're probably going to push a little bit harder during that 4th week versus if you didn't know that you had a deload week coming up, then you might not push as hard. So there's a huge mental aspect just knowing that you have a deload week coming up. And that's why I'm a huge advocate of planning them into your training. Like, I think that they should be part of your training, not necessarily like an afterthought. There is some people who say that, you can auto-regulate your deload weeks or regulate them in the sense of like when you're starting to feel sore, then you would take a deload week the next week. But in my opinion, it's probably too late in that sense. Like, well, not too late, but it's just like you're probably teetering on the edge of maybe not feeling so great during that week before your deload week. So anyway, with all that being said, I just think it's very, very important to strategically plan your deload weeks into your training depending on, how long your cycles are. So for example, like if you're doing a 4-week mesocycle or 4-week training block, having a deload week every 5th week, maybe if you're doing, that would be like a 5-week training block. So say you're doing a 5-week mesocycle, then your 5th week would be a deload. If you're doing 6 weeks, that's what I'm doing right now. So my 6th week is always a deload, or at least that's what it is now. With a lot of my clients, we program 4-week training cycles. And then I usually put a deload week every 5th or 6th week, depending on where that person's at. So in that regard, it does depend on like also how many training days you are doing a week and how intense your training is. Also, if you're in maybe like a fat loss phase versus if you're in a surplus, there might be like, you might be able to push off a deload week, maybe one more week if you're in a surplus versus if you're in a fat loss phase and you don't have, as much recovery resources available. So anyway, now I am diving deep into deload weeks, but I definitely would just check out episode 58. A few weeks ago, I recorded it, or if it went live a few weeks ago. So check it out. I'll link it in the show notes. dive into everything deload weeks. And if you have any further questions about deload weeks, definitely let me know and I'll be happy to answer them. Okay, second to last question for today. How to know if you're cheating a rep? Okay, I love this question. This is actually something that I just talked about with Danny Vega in the podcast that went live a few days ago, or no, last week. Yeah. So I'll link that in the show notes. It's episode 63, Principles and Methods for Building Muscle with Danny Vega. So in that episode, we talk about something specific that Danny and our friend Ben Bakulski talk about a lot. It's called SSI, and it stands for Set Up, Stabilize, and Initiate. So Danny dives into this in that episode, but basically you're setting up for your anatomy, you're stabilizing at your joints, and you're initiating the movement. And so that is a really good way to understand and know that you are going through each rep, and each rep is, or you're maximizing the effectiveness of each rep that you're doing, right? So SSI, set up, stabilize, and initiate. Again, check out episode 63. I'll link that in the show notes to get a little bit more information on that concept. But I would say that, in my opinion, how to really truly know if you are cheating a rep or hopefully not cheating a rep is to film yourself, right? So it's important to see what your form is like, what your body position is like, to ensure that you are, doing the exercise correctly and to, your best ability, in the sense of you are not cheating, right? So you're doing the rep in the sense that you have, and I talked about this in the episode with Danny, but you establish consistent start and end points with the movement you're doing. So if you film yourself, you can see this. So for example, if you're doing like a squat and you know that you need to get below parallel, if it's kind of hard. I mean, you can probably sense it, but it's really hard to see if you're actually getting below parallel or if you're actually getting as low as you were maybe last week when you lifted weights or when you lifted that weight with that squat. So for me, I always try to film myself as much as possible, especially if I'm questioning my range of motion and if I actually am doing the rep as effectively as I could be. So filming yourself is super important. Danny talks about this, but you should, if you film yourself 1 week and if you film yourself consistently over 5 weeks, you should be able to place those videos on top of each other and they should look exactly the same, right? Because you want to be starting at the same position, ending at the same position to ensure that you're getting an effective rep out of every single rep that you do. Another example of this is, and I talked about this a little bit, but with those start and end points, like for example, if you're doing a bicep curl, knowing where your start and end point is. So your start point being your triceps flexed and your arms extended all the way out. And then maybe your ending position is when you do the bicep curl and maybe your pinky is at your eyebrow or something. So you know that every single time you do a rep, you are going to finish with your tricep flexed, and you're going to, start with your tricep flexed and finish with your pinky at your eyebrow or something like that. So just establishing those start and end points can be very, very effective for knowing that you're not cheating the rep. And then also going back to, things like, especially for bicep curls, swinging, and not having a stable shoulder joint, swinging the weight up, and not controlling on the way down. Those are all ways to quote unquote cheat a rep. So yeah, that's what I would recommend is first film yourself. And then second, just know what your start and end points are and make sure that you are doing those and starting and ending at the same spot every single rep. So that would be my best advice to know if you're cheating a rep or not. Okay, last question today. What are the best vitamins for postmenopausal women? Okay, so I don't know why I just did that. Again, this is another, it depends, because everybody is so different in the sense of in terms of vitamins and minerals. Are you deficient in a specific vitamin or mineral? That would depend if you would be taking those to replenish, right? So that's the first thing. And this is not obviously just for postmenopausal women, but for anybody. If you think that you're deficient in anything, getting, tested is obviously one thing to make sure that you are actually deficient in it and you should be supplementing with it. But in general, I think, and this is something that, I talk about all the time, is it all starts with your diet and making sure that you are getting, foods that are as close to nature as possible, that you're consuming whole foods on a daily basis as close to nature as possible, that have either one, had a face at some point, or two, grown from the earth at some point. That should be 80% of your diet on a daily basis. And then also getting adequate protein, which I talked about before. In terms of supplementation, I think, again, that it's so individualized to the person. And if you are, again, deficient in something, overall for women especially, I think, and this is just from my experience, but a lot, and not just women, but everybody actually, men and women. So collagen is something that, especially recently, I found that, supplementing for myself and when I recommend it for clients and even my parents, we, especially now in our day and age, we don't eat nose to tail. So we don't get a lot of the amino acids that come with collagen. So if you're eating, a bunch of bone broth, homemade bone broth from real bones, if you are eating nose to tail, animals nose to tail, then you're probably getting a good amount of collagen. But most of us don't consume bone broth, especially like real homemade bone broth on a daily basis. And most of us don't consume nose to tail on a daily basis. So supplementing with collagen can be something that's definitely helpful in terms of, hair, skin, all of those things, and making sure that you're optimizing that as you're aging. And this is something like with my mom, for example, I recommended for her to start taking collagen, and even my dad too. And my mom noticed that her hair actually stopped falling out after taking collagen daily for a month, whether that was in regards to taking the collagen or just in general increasing her protein intake. I don't know for sure, but it can't really hurt in my opinion. So collagen is probably one of the and this isn't even a vitamin. This is just a supplement. I don't know why collagen came to mind. But in terms of when we're talking about, I think, with this question, she said, what's the best vitamins for postmenopausal women? I feel like you might have meant like supplementation in general, like vitamins, mineral supplements, all of that. So yeah, I would say maybe check out the episode that I did with Shawn Wells. We talked about the top 5 supplements that everyone should consider taking. That is episode 33. I will link that in the show notes for you to check out. But again, it just really comes down to you as an individual and what you are, or if you are deficient in anything. But I would first start with making sure that you are consuming a good whole foods diet as close to nature as possible, that you're consuming enough nutrients, enough adequate protein every single day, and then go from there. So hopefully that helps a little bit. And that's all the questions that we have for today. As always, if you're enjoying this podcast, please make sure to share it with your friends and family. You can take a screenshot as you're listening to it, to post it on Instagram on your story and tag me at rachelgregory.cns. I am doing these Q&A sessions every single week. And I usually post a question box on my Instagram on Monday afternoon. So definitely look out for that if you have any questions. Or you can always message me on Instagram or send me an email. My email is rachel@metflexlife.com with any questions that you want me to address during these sessions. All right, thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you next week.